Well, the stage has been set again. I'd like to present now a development of some of the aspects that Lynn has now just raised and that has been put on the table. Our next speaker is a leading expert in the global agricultural and food crisis. She has collaborated with farmers and leading scientists involved in this fight for a true fight to end hunger for decades. And she has a conception of how our agricultural policy should work probably better than anyone in the nation. So I'm very happy to present to you Ms. Marcia Mary Baker.
Madam Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, we're appreciative for a message from India that has come to the conference, and I'll begin with that. It's from Professor Swaminathan. He's in Chennai at the Swaminathan Foundation. And before I read it, I will just say briefly who he is, and that is he's a world-famous wheat geneticist, and he is the one who collaborated with other scientists, in particular Dr. Norman Borlaug, the American crop scientist who worked in Mexico and is considered the father of the Green Revolution. And it was 50 years ago this year that in India, Dr. Norman Borlaug was welcomed by Dr. Swaminathan, who was a young man, director of wheat research in India, and many others in the team. And by 1974, India had become self-sufficient in grains after a couple hundred years of repeated famines under the British Empire. And with one final note, I will say that Dr. Swaminathan likes to repeat over the decades that he was born in 1925, so he grew to manhood during the end of this empire. And what impressed him was the terrible Bengal famine, which was 70 years ago, 1942-43, in which up to 3 million people died. He committed himself to agriculture, and it's often said, sometimes rather said in India, that Mahatma Gandhi gave India its freedom and Swaminathan gave India its food. Here's what he says to us today. 2013 marks the 150th anniversary of the initiation of land-grant colleges in the U.S. by President Abraham Lincoln. These colleges, which led to the establishment of agricultural universities in India, have played a key role in helping to improve the productivity, profitability, and sustainability of major food crops. In India, for example, 2013 marks the transition from what was described in the 1960s as ship-to-mouth existence to right to food with homegrown food. Such transition has become possible only because of synergy among technology, public policies relating to input-output pricing, and above all, farmers' enthusiasm. This is an appropriate year to review the Second American Revolution, designed to convert President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 4 freedoms into reality. I wish the conference great success. From Dr. Swaminathan on June 20th. So let's begin with a snapshot of the world food and national food crisis, and we'll summarize it by putting all together on a per-person basis the volume of grain output in the since the Second World War. And let me just say simply this. We were going upward in the volume of grain produced per person in the world from after the war till about 1980, 1985. We went from a miserable quarter of a ton maybe to up to maybe 720 pounds. A quarter of a ton up to 720 pounds, which isn't much per person. It would fit in the back of a small pickup truck, but it was on the rise. From the 1980s to now, total world grains per person has gone up and down, and in net, it is going down. Now, you know that apart from those in the 30s who survived on cornmeal 3 times a day, and we're lucky here, you need the grain, too, for livestock, for meat animals, it's all going in reverse. The number of cattle in the United States is now where it was back in 1952. The same process is taking place elsewhere. And let's look at the geography of the world food situation. You know that due to what was described by Helga Zepp-LaRouche as the criminal system in the world, who eats and who doesn't is decided by cartels, used to be called by a pope the structures of sin. The darkest places on this map from the Food and Agriculture Organization in the world are the places of worst hunger and worst deprivation. You see Africa, but parts of the Americas, Haiti, Central America, and in Asia. And I'll tell you, it's not, in addition, you hear if there's maybe an earthquake somewhere, we send some food, we should. But on a tonnage basis internationally, the volume of food aid right now is nothing. It's maybe a third what it was in the 1990s, which was inadequate. So we're not responding, and we don't have it. That's the snapshot. Now I'd like to go to set that aside, keep it in mind. I want to say that it was 25 years and 2 months ago that Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche initiated the founding of the Schiller Institute Food for Peace effort. It took place in Chicago in September that year. Several people in the room were there. And it's true, it was occasioned by a terrible drought in the Midwest. The corn shriveled up, but that wasn't the point. The effort of the Schiller Institute then was to prevent what you've heard described now, the crisis we're in today. And that's what brought diplomats and farmers together. And there was an emergency meeting, a second meeting in Chicago in December 1988, at which Mr. Lyndon LaRouche came to speak. And it would end up being weeks before he was completely wrongfully jailed. But he spoke then, and the title of his presentation was, "Give Us This Day Our Daily Bread." And he spoke about the biosphere. He spoke about nuclear power and the collaboration we must have between East and West. And he said, you must put a higher order into the biosphere as a matter of course of history. You can't turn back the clock, or it's doom. And the question he posed, literally, is who will answer this prayer? And that's what brings us here today. Now, let me speak of how the enemy answers the world food crisis that we have. And by that, I mean the enemy that created this will turn to the fact that we're parched out here in the West, or there isn't enough food, and they say, oh, peak population. We've reached the end of the line with fertilizer. There isn't any more left. And in particular, you hear it all the time, but the Group of Eight had a pre-meeting a week earlier in London this month, and the Parliamentary Commission said, here's what you should do given the world food crisis. Bill Gates was there, Prime Minister Cameron. They said, eat less meat. It will share the scarcity. They said, have more population birth control. It will improve the ratio. So we don't have to go into that more, but one point I want to make. The nail in the coffin is the idea that we should take food in the midst of this scarcity. Even if you thought you were green, are people going to die? That's what's happening. The nail in the coffin is to burn food for fuel. And let me just say the scale of this is we're burning over 10% of the world's corn for fuel, because it's 40% of the U.S. corn is going for that. A big percent of the cane in Brazil, a big percent of oil seeds from Africa and soy is going into diesel. It's flowing into Europe for biodiesel. So this is a death sentence. You can quantify it, by the way, of course, that if you're impoverishing the World Health Organization figures that for every 1 million people that are pushed into poverty, at least, this sounds low, but don't get confused, 6,000 absolutely are guaranteed to die from undernourishment, disease, and infection. And so we're killing about 250,000 people a year directly because of the impoverishment of suppressing agriculture and general economic activity for this false quack pseudoscientific reason that we're supposed to quit overheating the Earth. Leave that aside again. Let's go to the principle of development. And I want to take an example less often used, but it's a good one from Abraham Lincoln's economist. His name was Henry Carey, and he wrote reams against the British East India Company system. In 1847, he wrote a book called The Past, the Present, and the Future. And in particular, what he stated the development principle, that mankind's discovery allows him to solve the paradox, natural resources are man-made. That's the way it is. And the particular men he refuted included a stock jobber, day trader named David Ricardo, who said mankind always goes into the best land and best water, then uses it up, and then has to die off. So, not so in principle, said Henry Carey, and not so in practice. And he describes in The Past, Present, and Future how, picture the eastern seaboard settlement going westward. They run into the Ridge and Valley region, that's the Appalachians, and that's the Blue Ridge Mountain of Virginia and so forth. The high part of the ridges, said Carey, is where the scrubbiest trees, the patchy brush takes place, so you can take a saw and it's easy to cut it down. And that's where the first settlements occur, which is true. Those are the homesteads. And when people moved there, put in a crop, did okay, developed things, became human, then they would have the power to go down to the rich bottomland, where the heavy trees are, and where they had the axe to fell those, and then they could drain the swamps and create new resources, land and water. So carry that through. You had the saw, the axe, then the bulldozer. We could go to the fusion torch. There is no end to development. So carry that through now to where we get today. Fortunately, there were institutional expressions of this. The Abraham Lincoln's creation of the Department of Agriculture and Land Grant System. Then in 1902, relevant to where we are today, the 17 westernmost states, many of which are dry, not all, were focused on by the Bureau of Reclamation, as English called it then. Reclaiming land meant irrigation, so Bureau of Reclamation. And they carried through up to the famous Franklin Delano Roosevelt period of big projects, and I think you have an image of those. But what we want to fast forward to is after the 1950s and after the Second World War, there was a fabulous potential upthrust of the productive platform of the United States and the world. And let's look at three areas: land and water together, power, and science. And right here in California in 1957 began the official launching of the California Water Plan. Here's a snapshot of it from the 1990s. Don't worry about analyzing it, that's not the point. The concept was take the whole state, and the dark arrow vectors you see are to move water from where it's plentiful in the north to where you need it in the dry south. So that's the disaggregated regions of California and the relative amounts of water flow that go between them. But the 1950s head of hydrology in California knew that if you build this, in 30 to 50 years, it would not be sufficient. And this was a fabulous comprehensive plan. No, they instigated what became the North American Water and Power Alliance, which you see here in a 1960s map from the Parsons engineering firm in Anaheim. And this was taken before Congress. President Kennedy, his brother, was supported. And what went along with this, we just think in a very quick snapshot way, is 1957, the same year, was the first nuclear power plant, commercial plant, open in the United States in Shippingsport, western Pennsylvania. And the presumption was you would go out and improve the environment this way. Up to 200 nuclear plant orders and sites were conceived of. And thirdly, during the same 1950s time period, was the terrific analysis of science to improve plant life, even anticipate improving photosynthesis. And you heard about the Green Revolution. Another inducement to this was the vision of going to the moon and to space. So space agriculture research was done to look at the way you could have confined agriculture with a lot of power, with water where you wanted. In fact, you'd even have soilless agriculture. But next, you might see Indira Gandhi. She stood up when the World Bank said you can't do it, and she said no. She issued a postage stamp. She planted the new genetic improved wheat in her front yard. But all of this was thwarted. In fact, in particular, North American Water and Power Lines was shelved. We only built 104 nuclear plants, and only 15 or 16 are west of the Mississippi. But one of the worst things is it was this time period where there was the patenting of research itself in terms of seeds and the means to life. The 1970 Plant Variety Act, that took place, and then it gave rise through court decisions to allow an improved seed through biotechnology and genetic engineering to be patented as if it was a better wheelbarrow or a better mousetrap. And this put the intense lid on everything. So in fact, we've stayed in the same mode for 40 years. We haven't had new developments. We've depleted the groundwater, because if you don't have increased surface water, which in brief, what this map shows, what the intention was, is to go to the northwesternmost part of the continent where you have Alaska and the Yukon, divert merely 11% of the runoff there into, collected in reservoirs, divert it down through British Columbia. It's going to come in around Idaho, Montana area, then through power to lift it up there. It can gravity flow and otherwise be pumped up at different key points and bring additional water, sometimes up to twice as much surface water, down to the dry southwestern areas. And this plan, which with some 369 projects, was the realistic plan. Without it, and there may be some more images that can be put through, and if not, that's all right. You can picture in your mind what happened is we are completely vulnerable whenever some episode of drought occurs, and of course drought can take place due to much larger solar or galactic cycles and reactions. But you have the wells are running dry, the surface water isn't there, so what happens? Now, if you picture the 17 western states, we have an image, but if it doesn't come up, you know what I'm talking about. It's from there's Indira Gandhi, that was nice. We can keep going now. And there's her postage stamp with the wheat revolution in 1968. We can keep going. And we see the space agriculture, which you pictured in your mind, and we continue now to where we are. Though that's a map of some of the 40 aquifers. There are many aquifers in the country, but look at the big red part in the Great High Plains. As you go farther southward and it gets more red, that's the tremendous depletion of the High Plains Ogallala aquifer system down into Texas, Oklahoma, and southeastern Colorado, where you have dust bowl formations of huge dust storms, even on a mini version like you have now in Central Valley, California. And if we keep going to where we are now, with another image, and then, if possible, that's the drought, and we're here amidst it, and we can continue further along. That's just the Ogallala aquifer on the right-hand side blown up, because instead of looking to the irrigation on the lower left, you see what you have on the right. We'll continue to the 17 states in the west. And here is what has been referred to already today, the percent of the national food output that was centralized here thanks to the projects which are 50 years old. That is, look at Texas. 45% of the cattle of the nation are in the 7 high plain states. 65% of the wheat of the nation, not including California, comes from the high plain states. And that's 50% of the hay, of course, it goes with the cattle and dairy. We won't go through them all, but come back here to California. 45% of the nation's milk comes from the 17 reclamation states, 20% here in California, and it's all being, the number of dairy cows is going down. Everything is at stake and everything is threatened. As I said before, and we can go to the final image, the bins are empty, the well is dry, the lake is low to nothing. And so this is the NWAPA 21 picture on what we're circulating today. This is the image of this is at one with reinstituting Glass-Steagall, including building up nuclear, not taking it down like San Onofre and elsewhere. And the final image is just pictures that summarize what I said, because understand that on the left is what Dr. Swaminathan talked about. Norman Rockwell painted FDR's Freedom from Want. And Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace was the 1950s. This is what Glass-Steagall embodied. It is the gateway to, and in fact, the emergency measures we need should be ringing in your mind. Ban biofuels. And under those corn and soy growers, overnight, put a floor price, a parity price, to keep their situation stable. That's our food supply. Do the same for every sector. Get the dairy sector out here in California and everywhere here and abroad, a price that's stable. That is security. We can do this. We can bust up the cartels. We can end the Monsanto seed control of science. It's controlling the means to life. We can answer the prayer.